much. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Julia Hegewald, whom I have known for many years. She is a professor of Asian art history and the head of the Department of Asian and Islamic Art History at the University of Bonn in Germany. And before she took that position, she was a reader in art history at the University of Manchester. She was also before that a postdoc fellow at the South Asia Institute of Heidelberg University in Germany. And before that, a research fellow at the University College at Oxford. Professor Hegewald received her PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Her main research areas are water architecture in Asia, Jain, temple art and architecture in India. She also works on Asian city planning and on the theory of reuse. Professor Hegewald has published widely on the art and architecture of South Asia and the Himalayas. Her latest monograph on Jain temple architecture in Karnataka was published by JACO and the Deccan Heritage Foundation in 2021. And the topic of her talk today is Superiority, Dependence and Continuity, the art and architecture of the Jaina community in Karnataka. I very much look forward to this talk and welcome to Professor Hegewald.
Professor Bühnemann, thank you so much for your very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here today and to be sharing some ideas on my latest research with you. Let me start sharing my PowerPoint so you have images to clarify the situation. I hope you can all see this.
Yes.
The paper I'm presenting to you today examines the changing fortunes of the Jaina community in the South Indian state of Karnataka. From the early 5th century onwards, the influence of the Jainas in the region appears continuously to have increased. At this time, many kings and their ministers were actually Jainas, and literature, the arts and architecture clearly expressed Jaina ideas, and they were also fashioned by Jainas themselves. However, this very positive flowering situation substantially changed during the middle of the 12th century. Already, actually, from the 10th century onwards, internal changes had taken place in Jaina society, practice, and the religious values they maintained. And this made them more, as I would argue, more susceptible to harm. This situation was further exacerbated by the arrival of competing religious groups in the area. Especially threatening for the Jainas was a religious group, that of the Vīra-Śaivas, which I'll come back to in a moment. And as a consequence of the growth of Vīra-Śaiva power and dominance in particular, the Jainas lost most of their influence and were actively persecuted in Karnataka. During this period of religious and political and communal upheaval, Jaina icons, temples, and religious centers were destroyed, as you can see in this starting image here. But also they were annexed, adapted, and reused, particularly by Vīra-Śaiva followers. However, we have to say, despite this severe decline in Jaina authority, the faith actually continued to be practiced and it survived. And this illustrates in some ways the power of reuse as a cultural phenomenon, which even in situations of extreme asymmetrical dependency can provide freedoms and continuities to subdued people and cultural traditions. The work I'm showing or sharing with you today is part of a large research project, and it still presents work in progress. And these are sort of very short, the core issues which I would now like to explore with you in more detail. Now, my interest in dependency research derives from an interdisciplinary and trans-regional research cluster based at the University of Bonn since about 2018-19, in which I'm involved as one of the principal investigators. And this cluster explores slavery. Here it's the Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies, explores slavery and other forms of severe asymmetrical dependency in the widest sense. And it inquires into the limitations posed by dependencies, but also it examines the freedoms which can still be found in situations of extreme dependency. So it's not just the negative, but also the survival, the positive views, which particularly artists and architects have always found in situations of difficulties. Also, just as a brief introduction for those not so familiar with the Jaina religion, Jainism originates in the East Indian state of Bihar in about the 5th, 6th century before the Common Era. A severe drought which affected the region during the 4th century BCE caused large sections of the Jaina community to migrate from the area, and the Jainas ventured both into the west of India, northwest, that's largely Rajasthan and Gujarat, and a second section moved south into Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, resulting in a split, in a schism into the Digambaras, whom you can see a representative photo of on the right, the sky-clad or naked group of Jainas, and the Shvetambaras, where the monks wear white or cotton clothes, resulting in this name. Legends reflect the introduction of Jainism to Karnataka in the south of India through the Jaina religious teacher Bhadrabahu in the 4th century before the Common Era. And the photo here on the top right shows actually what we believe, or which allegedly is, Bhadrabahu's meditation and enlightenment cave on Chandragiri at Shravana-Belgola in Karnataka. All the images I'm showing you today, or from now onwards, come from Karnataka, from this modern state. And the Chandragupta Basadi on the same hill at Shravana-Belgola has these two very beautiful 12th century steatite screens, which consist of 45 panels each. Here you can see a detail. And this, the panels on these two screens illustrate the alleged journey of Bhadrabahu, the sacred Jaina teacher, together with Chandragupta Maurya, who is the grandfather of the Emperor Ashoka, down to the south. Now, despite this legend and the many representations and sites connected with this story, it is actually historically more likely that the religion was transmitted from Bihar, where Jainism originates, through Orissa along the east coast into Tamil Nadu, and that it reached Karnataka from there in the early centuries of the Common Era, probably about the 2nd century of the Common Era. Jainism became quickly, firmly established and proliferated extensively till about the 9th century. One reason we assume for its popularity was the Digambara Jaina subgroup of the so-called Yapaniyas, who were more liberal than Digambaras normally are, than mainstream Digambara monks or the religion is. And the Yapaniyas contributed to the firm integration of Jainism into the wider society, and they contributed also to the propagation of communal harmony throughout the region. After this initial phase of introduction and first consolidation during the early centuries, from which we really only have carvings, a few images surviving, such as these line drawings of foot imprints with an inscription referring back to an Enlightenment site here at Shravana-Belgola, Jainism then really started to flourish intensely and actively from the 9th to about the 11th, 12th centuries. And these temple buildings, which you can see here, stem from this early period in the 9th century. This is the Chandragupta Basadi from the middle of the 9th century. And this down here is a very complex 5-shrined temple at Kambathali, the Panchakuta Basadi, dating from the late 9th century, but it has some additions from the 10th and 11th centuries. Now, these temples date from the Ganga period, this period, and also the following Hoysala age, are sort of classified as the golden age of Jainism in Karnataka. It's of course a very complex and contested term, but it's still used a lot in the literature. In the up to the 12th century, literature in the south is almost exclusively Jaina in authorship, and very large numbers of temples and sacred sites were established throughout the region. So we have this period of blooming, of flowering, of expansion. However, this period was soon followed by pressures, intimidations, and coercions. Already during the second half of the 11th and in the early 12th century, the Jainas came under relentless political and physical attack, leading to a severe decline and a struggle for survival in the area. Now, it is, in a way, I find almost ironic that it was this phase, or the phase of stability, calm, and increased authority, which I've just outlined, under the rule, particularly of the Kalyani Chalukyas in the north and the Hoysalas in the south of Karnataka. These are all Hoysala temples, which you can see here. So this is the period from the early 10th century onwards, which appears to have motivated the Jainas themselves to undertake substantial changes in the organization, the social outlook, and the structure of their own religion. This is reflected, for instance, in the emergence of Jaina castes, the elaboration of ritual practices, and the establishment of monastic institutions as more permanent seats of learning and land ownership. Maybe just a few words about these wonderful Hoysala temples. The two photographs on the top show the Kamala Basti at Belgaum from 1204, an outside and an inside view. You see how elaborate these ceilings are. Down below here is the site of Halebit with 3 Jaina temples. And this is a beautiful ceiling in this detached hall. So I've just outlined changes, internal changes taking place in Jainism. And castes which were created in Jainism at this time had been absent from the earlier archaic form of the religion. The fragmentation of Jainism into a number of castes and subgroups, such as the Yapanias, which I just mentioned before, which all paid allegiance to different monastic headquarters, the matas. This is, for instance, here on the left, the mata in Karkal. This diminished the unity of the Jaina population. In the following, this made it easier for others to split, fragment, and to disempower the community. Whether an intensification of ritual practices and an increase in the pantheon and the images we find in Jaina temples, as you can see here on the right, and the development of tantric Jainism further undermined the faith, remains, I would argue, questionable. However, this tendency weakened and diluted its distinct nature and established closer links to Hindu ritual practices. So it blurred at least the borders, the limits to the other religions. The originally extremely aesthetically minded Jaina religious institutions had amassed enormous wealth and developed into dominant landowners during this period. And from the early 12th century, the support of influential royal families in the region declined, and resentment against the often wealthy and perceived as authoritarian Jaina elite led to confrontations. This resulted in discrimination and at times in communal violence. In addition to these internal reasons I've just outlined, which the Jainas were responsible for themselves, and which to a certain extent undermined the authority of the Jaina community, there are also external forces in the form of other religious groups which started to threaten Jainism in Karnataka too. The religion which gained most rapidly in power at this time were the so-called heroic Śrī-Vaisṇavas. In Sanskrit, this would be Vīra the heroic, the Vīra-Śaivas, also known as Liṅgāyats, the worshippers of the Linga. Vīra-Śaivism was initiated in northern Karnataka by Basava, whom you can see here on the left, also known as Basaveshvara or Basavana, who lived between 1131 and 1196. Vīra-Śaivism is a bhakti reform movement focusing on the god Shiva. However, Vīra-Śaivism is a distinct phase and not just a subgroup of Hinduism. This, for instance, becomes apparent in its complete rejection of multiple gods, of the concept of karma and the authority of the Vedas. Vīra-Śaivas preach against social inequalities and reject the caste system. Interestingly, the Jains have just accepted and introduced it. They reject it. Orthodox followers of the Vīra-Śaiva faith reject temple worship, sacrifices, and the concepts of purity and pollution. They worship Shiva in the form of his symbol, the linga, which they wear in a thread around their neck. Now, this on the right is a particularly beautiful and elaborate linga holder. This is not what people usually wear on day-to-day occasions. Most people just have a simple cotton thread and a little sachet in which they wear the linga around their neck. Now, in addition to the Vīra-Śaivas, which we have just talked about, also local mainstream Shaivas and Kalamukas. Kalamukas are an extreme Shaiva sect worshipping Bhairava and Kali. They all gained in power at this time. Following the communal unrest, the Jainas were turned into a minority in Karnataka. Before, there had been a clear majority. They had dominated. Now they were turned into a minority, with different Shaiva denominations all increasing in numbers and authority. In addition to this locally, largely local regional strife from the mid-12th century, also Śrī-Vaiṣṇavas, those are Bhakti followers of Vishnu from Tamil Nadu, penetrated into the region from the southeast. And from the late 13th century onwards, also Muslim groups penetrated into the area of northern Karnataka from the north. So you can see it's a situation of enormous religious change and competition for power. Locally, new religions being created, but also incoming groups moving into the area. As we have seen in the demise of the Jainas, internal and external reasons came together. These are just two photographs of Vīra-Śaiva sacred sites where you can see that they venerate the gurus and don't have images of Shiva, for instance. It's just the Vīra-Śaiva gurus, and the gurus' a place of death or cremation or cenotaphs are particularly venerated here. The importance of Vīra-Śaivas in trade and commerce appears to have expedited the swift conversion to the new phase of the ruling Jaina families of landowners and heads of trade guilds. This had catastrophic consequences for the maintenance of Jaina temples and the funding of costly ceremonies, as conversions resulted in the withdrawal of the financial support which Jainism had previously experienced. With the conversion of such influential players, such as important Jaina landowners, to Vīra-Śaivism or to other faith groups, the ordinary population followed suit. We can generally say that important leaders, let's say if the king was a Vaishnava, a Vishnu supporter, then the local population usually followed this phase. So this kind of conversion of important players played an important role here. Due to the immense significance which temples as religious, economic, and political centers had for the Jaina community, the sacred edifices were usually the first to be targeted in the struggle for supremacy. All religious groups involved in this fight for control in the region participated in the destruction, but also in the conversion of Jaina statues and temples. So much to the religious and political background to set the scene, to make you understand what the situation was like. I would now like to turn with you to the art and architecture of the Jainas and the changes we can, or which were undertaken or which become visible in these areas. It's interesting that the internal religious changes taking place in Jainism, as well as the confrontation with other faith groups, had a marked effect on Jaina temple architecture in the region. Due to their changed outlook on life and religious practice, Jaina edifices were obviously very clearly transformed. The earlier Jaina temples of the Ganga period, which we mentioned before, we said they are roughly from the 4th, maybe to the 11th century maximum. The one above here, the temple above here at on the hill at Aihole stems from this period, exhibit an almost utilitarian, a very plain, simple character, and reflect a form of the religion of Jainism here, which propagated an ascetic lifestyle. It's almost as if the asceticism was visible in this very pure architecture, simple architecture. With an increase in authority and worldly influence, the growth of monastic institutions and the economic influence of the temples, the socio-religious values of the Jainas appear to have changed. At least some Jaina temples dating from the subsequent Hoysala period, which you can see an example down here. This period lasts roughly from the 11th to the 14th century. This temple here is at Jinanathapura. These temples display an amount of decoration and ornamentation, which visually represents a celebration of beauty, one could argue, and a more this-worldly outlook. It's much more decorated, adorned, it's much more wealthy in its outlook. I have, though, to admit that this temple is really the most decorated and the most complex one that I at least know in the region. But I think you can see an obvious change here. So these are changes within Jainism, which is reflected in the architecture. Even more marked than these voluntary stylistic changes was the influence which, for instance, Vīra-Śaivas and other denominations had on Jaina temple architecture. Starting with the early or mid-12th century, large numbers of sacred places, which were hubs of wealth and social and political centers, were looted and destroyed. As the icons were the most important elements of these sacred sites, as is still the case today, these were often targeted first within the assaults. It's interesting that we can discover or outline different approaches towards these images. Large numbers of Jaina temples were robbed of their sacred statues, and then we only have an empty seat surviving. Here, a statue of a Jaina was placed before. This comes from the former Jaina temple in the village of Aihole. And if the images were removed, as is the case here, the temples were frequently spared and not destroyed, as this rendered them religiously and politically impotent and deprived the community of their authority, because the images gave authority and influence to them. This was also the case in the Chandranateshvara Basadi, which you can see here on the right at Bhatkal, whose statues were all stolen and which has not been reconsecrated, although the temple was only marginally damaged, but it was never taken into use again. However, statues were not always completely removed. There are instances where the images were left behind, but desecrated. For this, it sufficed to take them from their pedestals to place them on the ground, as you can see here on the right in the former Jaina temple at Halo, where the image has just been set on the ground in the hall, which one would never do with a venerated image. In a Vīra-Śaiva context, they were often smeared with ashes, known as vibhuti, which you can also see on the image here on the left, signaling their annexation and conversion. In other instances, the statues were disfigured by cutting off an arm, or as you can see here on the right, a face or a foot, different parts. So the image was damaged, so it couldn't function properly anymore. This is an example from Halur on the right, and this actually both are from Halur. Even more powerful than the damage or defacement of a statue is its full decapitation, as you can see in the two images here from Aihole on the left and from Lakhundi on the right. The complete elimination of the head precludes a later reconsecration of the statue and prevents devotees from looking at the eyes, which play such an important role in Jaina ritual and veneration cults. Beheaded figures were frequently displayed at the front of temples, as you can see here on the right at Lakhundi, to signal their takeover. So anybody approaching this former Jaina temple knew by seeing the image that this was not under Jaina control anymore. Interesting is that when the Jainas regained control over some of these sites later on, they often kept the images in these places. It's, for instance, the case here in Lakhundi. In their restated Jaina context, these images act as reminders of a violent past and, more positively, as symbols of survival, and indirectly, Jainas would argue, a sign of superiority, because Jainism has been victorious in the end. The disengaged limbs and heads, which you can see here on the left, for instance, in Lakshmeshwar, which were cut off stone figures, were also put on display in Jaina shrines. First by the perpetrators as signals of takeover and control, and later by the Jaina community itself as reminders of the violence it had suffered. Therefore, it is reasonably rare for such scarred statues to have been restored. Exceptions of those are those placed in the niches, which you can see here on the right, in the Panchakuta Basadi at Kambathalli, which were very crudely, but they were restored for the Mahamastak Abhisheka in 2018. And you can see that the face, the genitals, and also the foot, which had been cut off, have been kind of recreated, but people have made it very clear that these are restoration parts and that harm was done to these statues before. So we have looked at images so far. However, not only the statues, but also the temple edifices were damaged or entirely demolished. Here on the left at Halle Belgola, you can see such a destroyed temple, destroyed in an onslaught on this site. We know that large numbers of Jaina temples were completely razed to the ground, of course, only by inscriptions or historical documents in these religiously motivated attacks. We have sites where we know that 64 temples existed, as for instance at Chikahana-Soge, but only one has survived. We have inscriptions telling us about such destructions. And a noteworthy case is the Adinata Basti at Srirangapatnam, which was only raised in 1589, so after this period of struggle. But it's interesting for us in this context because the statues housed inside, some of which you can see here in the two images on the right, have all come from demolished Jaina temples in the area. According to legend, there were 1,008 Jaina temples. This is an auspicious, a mythical number. Of course, there weren't so many probably, but as you can see, I mean, this is only a small amount of the images held in this temple, that there must have been many more temples which were destroyed, which then all were removed to this site. Above entirely crushed temples, new buildings could be erected by other religious groups or later even by the Jaina community itself. At some sites, severely damaged temples were later also reconstructed. A striking example is the Shankar Jinalaya at Lakshmeshwar, originally commissioned by the Kalyani Chalukyas in the 11th century, visible on these two slides here. And the attack on this temple was so ferocious and destructive that a faithful reconstruction, as you can see, was really impossible. Probably only the basement story was preserved, and you can see that we only have small pieces fitted together in what seems like a very haphazard fashion, because it was completely ground to small bits of stone. Really, nothing substantial survived. In other instances, only selected former building elements, such as thresholds, altars, door frames, lintels, or their guardians protecting the sanctuary, were reinserted into largely modern temple structures. This here are images from the city Basadi in Mysore. It's really a 20th century structure, but into which old Hoysala elements were integrated because the temple had completely been destroyed and it was only refashioned at this time. Another option chosen by newly dominant groups to express dependencies was to not to destroy and to raze to the ground these temples, but to absorb and to convert, and as such to reuse Jaina icons and temples. For those robbed of their honored places of worship, such sites visualize painful memories and act as reminders of humiliation and conversion. In Karnataka, there are particularly many examples of such temple conversions or reuses from Jaina to Vīra-Śaiva usage. And here again, we can identify three different approaches. We have temples which openly publicize the fact of appropriation. There is a kind of pride of victory visible here. Then we have some which evidently hide. They try to hide that this was a takeover and simulate that the temple was always Vīra-Śaiva from the start, which often is not possible, because of the date, because Basava only creates this religion in the 12th century. And then we have some temples which take a kind of middle path, which is not quite clear. Do they, it's sort of a less mindful approach. Now, converted shrines following the first approach, which openly advertises the enforced annexation, are reasonably rare. But this is a good example. This is the former Jaina temple at Halur, which is now a Vīra-Śaiva place. And the Vīra-Śaivas have not destroyed, oops, where's my cursor here, and removed the images. They have left the standing naked statues of the Jainas. It's always Parshvanatha and Bahubali. They have consciously been left on the outside to advertise that this was a Jaina temple. It's not being covered up here, that this is a takeover. Reused temples where the Jaina origin is less apparent are actually more numerous. And we encounter here, as I said, two different gradations of how cautiously the adaptation has been conducted. In some instances, actually, people have taken considerable care to remove all traces which might indicate a Jaina origin. So here it's covered up. In these examples, and we really only know through historical inscriptions or other written records that these temples were Jaina before. But in most cases, there are traces that a takeover has taken place. And this can be, for example, be seen in the Jaina statues, which normally adorn the lintels of the entrances to shrine rooms. And in these cases of the takeovers, often these Jaina images have been removed. They have been chiseled away. I think you can see these depressions here. The photos aren't so very good, but you can definitely not see images, but you'd see that there were, it looks a bit like halos, that there were figural statues before which have been removed, and they have not been replaced with anything new. So only the fact that the old denomination has been erased, but not a new being given, shows that this is a takeover. So there were Jaina images here, and we have many similar examples. These are here from Hangal on the left and Anigari on the right. And we would normally find Jainas and Jain divinities. And you can see here we have the Linga and the Nandi statue looking towards it, which signals this Vīra-Śaiva annexation. So here the takeover has not really been concealed. Although the outer walls of Jaina temples are often quite plain, sculptures have regularly been integrated into the roof structures of halls and shrines. Whilst iconographical remnants on the inside of former Jaina temples were in most cases carefully removed, because this is the sacred space in which the new religious cult is taking place. However, in more hidden places on the outside, these often survive. And this is the outside and the inside of a very interesting temple, the Naganatha temple. It's today a Vīra-Śaiva temple at Lakundi. And on the outside, you can still see seated Jaina images in the roof structure. Now, also on the inside, it's really fascinating. You remember the empty pedestal, which I showed you here again. This is the seat is Jaina, and it must have carried an image of Parshvanatha, the 23rd Jina, associated with the snake. But in this case, they didn't just empty the altar, but they placed a linga, and the linga Shiva is also connected with the seven-hooded snake. So it fits very interestingly, this shift from Jainism or Jaina usage to Shaiva usage. Much rarer than the annexation of architectural spaces or empty altars is the direct reuse of Jaina icons. This is more difficult because you remember in the beginning we said the Vīra-Śaivas don't have images. They only venerate the linga. But interestingly, in takeovers, they still annexed and reused the images as well. So here in Adagunchi, we have a Jina, a figural Jina. You see again the white ash, here it's now paint applied. This figure now is called Dodappa, paternal uncle, and these are meant to be his feet. They are of course the feet of a Jina, or then Kshetrapalas, which are guardians of the sacred temple compound, converted to Vīra-Śaiva use, where they really have no meaning whatsoever. I mean, the religion forbids the worship of images besides the symbol of the linga. Literary evidence and colonial records indicate continued discrimination against the Jaina community in Karnataka well into the 19th and 20th centuries. However, it is noteworthy that despite these threats, as well as real physical persecution, which we can see in the temple architecture as well, Jainism as well as Jaina art and architecture never completely ceased to be produced and develop. For instance, the faith continued to flourish under the protection of the Vijayanagara Empire. And here you can see 4 images of Jaina temples from Hampi and the neighboring site of Kamalapuram, which date from the 14th, 15th centuries. So after the main period of onslaught. So above we have the Parshvanatha temple, an outside and an inside view, a smaller temple from Hampi, which is very neglected, and this very beautiful Ganagiti or Kuntanatha temple from Kamalapuram. Also in the important religious center of Shravana-Belgola in the west of Bangalore, we encounter uninterrupted building activities by the Jainas. This temple here dates from 1325, this from 1398, and the Chenana Basadi down here from 1673, so completely uninterrupted. Jainism also continued to flourish in a number of provincial courts, particularly from the 15th century onwards, and especially distinct are the Jaina temples of coastal Karnataka. And here you can see a completely different approach to architecture, which reminds you maybe slightly of pagoda-style temples, because the temples here have been adapted to a climate of heavy rains. They are found along the west coast, where the monsoon meets onto the Indian subcontinent. This temple above and on the right is in Mudabidri, and the 2 down here come from Karkal, and they date all from the 15th, 16th century. Although the Jaina presence in the northern regions of Karnataka was much diminished by Vīra-Śaiva and Islamic followers, there is some continuity as well. Here on the left, for instance, I mean, we have seen the temples at Hampi, which are also in the north of Karnataka, and the one here on the left is at Bagalkot, showing Digambara Jaina continuity. Now, especially pronounced, however, is also a migration. You remember we have these 2 groups of Jainism, the Digambaras, who are more typical in the south. Everything we have seen really in terms of architecture was Digambara so far. But there is some migration of Shvetambara, so the northern version of, simplified, one might say, northern version of Jainism, into this area, largely from Rajasthan and Gujarat, and this is for commercial reasons. And this has mainly taken place in the past 40 to 50 years, although there are some earlier examples. This on top here, on the right on top, is a Shvetambara Jaina temple at Gadag, founded in 1914. But down below here, you can see that there are many contemporary building sites. This one here is a temple being under construction at Devanhalli, close to to Bangalore airport, also a Shvetambara foundation. This shows that there is an uninterrupted continuity of Jaina temple construction throughout the region of Karnataka to the present day. To conclude, the situation I've outlined in my presentation today shows very complex relationships and interactions between different religious groups in Karnataka. This was particularly pronounced during the period between the 12th and the 15th centuries, but in many areas continued well beyond it. Jainism was only one of many beliefs in a system of interrelated faith communities who were all competing for an increase in their following and for religious, political, and financial influence. Due to changes undertaken in their own religious structure during a period in which they found themselves in a situation of superiority, the Jainas appear to have become more susceptible to criticism and competition. Through these changes, Vīra-Śaivas in particular were able to gain power and to relegate the Jaina community to a situation of strong dependency in Karnataka. Despite this period of severe persecution, of which reminders are here on display at Kambathalli, Jainism survived at a number of provincial courts and with modest support from individual rulers and wealthy merchants succeeded to persist in a reduced form and slowly to expand its influence again. The Jainas managed from a situation of initial superiority to plunge into extreme dependency, but to succeed in achieving continuity to persistence and limited support, at first only in a number of regional courts, and from where the faith was able to spread and expand again. Through this, they have successfully survived as a vibrant religious tradition with an ongoing artistic and architectural development to the present day. And I would like to conclude with this last image, which actually shows that even today, when farmers plow their fields, images are being brought up, and very often they are Jaina images of such destroyed temples which were razed to the ground. Often they're damaged, but sometimes they are also quite perfectly preserved. But again, even today, in villages where Shaivas predominate, they're again annexed. They've again been marked by Shaivas, and it's obviously a naked Jaina aesthetic. With the Dwarapala, the door guardians, it's not quite so obvious, but this statue, they are immediately taken on. And I think this has more to do actually with the right to the ground. If it was a Jaina statue, this showed that the ground belonged once to a Jaina temple, and this might lead to legal problems. But it's also again showing that even today, when we are not used to quite such violent competition amongst religions, that there is still some competition or strife going on, even though it's not so violent as I described maybe in some of the images I showed you before. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Hegewald. I mean, this was fantastic. I've never seen such great examples